Welcome, dear viewer, to another journey through the quieter corners of history. Tonight, we're going to explore something you probably take for granted every single day. Something so ordinary, so commonplace in our modern world that you might not give it a second thought. The refrigerator, that humming box in your kitchen that keeps your milk cold and your vegetables crisp. That reliable guardian against spoilage and waste. Open it any time, day or night, and there it is. Cool air washing over your face. Shelves lined with fresh food that will last for days, even weeks. Perhaps there is leftover chicken from dinner 3 nights ago, still perfectly safe to eat. A carton of milk that has been there for a week. Vegetables in the crisper drawer, as fresh as the day you bought them. A block of cheese that will last for months. This convenience, this miracle of modern life, is remarkably recent. Your great-grandparents might have had an icebox, a wooden cabinet with a compartment for a large block of ice, delivered by the iceman who made his rounds through the neighborhood. The ice would melt gradually, and every few days, a new block would arrive. But even this was a luxury, available primarily in cities, primarily to those who could afford the regular ice delivery. Your great-great-grandparents almost certainly had no such thing, no icebox, no refrigeration of any kind. For the vast majority of human history, for thousands and thousands of years, people had to find other ways to keep food from spoiling. And if they failed at this task, the consequences were serious. Not just inconvenient, not just wasteful, but potentially deadly, because food spoils quickly, mercilessly. Meat left out in the warmth of a summer day would begin to rot within hours. The first signs might be subtle, a slight darkening of the color, a faint odor. But bacteria multiply exponentially. What starts as a few million becomes a few billion. The meat softens, develops a slimy surface, begins to smell unmistakably of decay. Flies arrive, drawn by the scent, laying their eggs. Within a day, the meat is clearly spoiled. Within 2 days, it is crawling with maggots. Milk would sour almost as quickly. Fresh milk, still warm from the cow, might be fine in the morning. By afternoon, in warm weather, it begins to separate. The cream rises, yes, but the milk itself starts to turn, a slightly sour smell, a change in texture. By evening, it is clearly sour, curdling if you try to warm it. By the next morning, it is completely unusable, unless you intend to make cheese, which is its own form of preservation. But that is a story for another time. Fruits would ferment, vegetables would wilt and decay, bread would grow fuzzy with mold, blue-green patches spreading across the surface, penetrating deep into the loaf. Fish, perhaps most perishable of all, would turn within hours of being caught. The eyes would cloud over, the flesh would soften, the smell would become overpowering. Without preservation, without some method of making food last, a bountiful harvest in autumn meant nothing come the barren months of winter. Imagine living in a climate with true seasons. Hot summers, frozen winters. Growing season might last from May to October, perhaps 6 months. The other 6 months, the ground is frozen. Nothing grows, nothing can be harvested. You're living entirely on what you managed to grow, hunt, or catch during those productive months, and what you managed to preserve. If you failed at preservation, you starved. It is that simple. It is that serious. This wasn't a minor inconvenience. This was survival. So tonight, we're going to step back in time, not to witness great battles or coronations, not to explore the lives of kings and queens. Those are stories for other nights, other videos. Instead, we're going to enter the kitchens, the cellars, the smokehouses and salt rooms of ordinary people. People whose names history doesn't remember. People who lived and died without anyone writing their biography. But people who did something remarkable, nonetheless. They developed and perfected methods to make food last. The techniques they used were ingenious, born of necessity, certainly. You develop ingenious solutions when failure means starvation, but also refined over generations, improved and perfected, shared and taught. A mother teaching her daughter, a father teaching his son. Knowledge passed down, sometimes over thousands of years, each generation adding their own refinements, their own observations, their own improvements. Some of these techniques are ancient. Salt preservation, we'll explore this in detail shortly, dates back at least to ancient Egypt, probably much earlier. Drying food in the sun is probably even older, possibly one of the first preservation methods humans ever discovered. Smoking might be equally ancient, discovered perhaps when someone noticed that meat hung near the fire lasted longer than meat stored elsewhere. Other techniques emerged more recently, but still long before electricity or modern chemistry or refrigeration. Pickling in vinegar probably dates back several thousand years. Sugar preservation became more common as sugar became more available, though even then it remained a luxury for most peoples. Fermentation, allowing beneficial bacteria to preserve food by producing acid, is ancient, though understanding why it worked is quite modern. What all these methods have in common is patience. These were slow processes, careful processes that required attention to detail, an understanding of seasons and weather, and a deep, almost intuitive knowledge of how food behaves over time. You couldn't rush salt curing. The salt needed weeks to penetrate deep into the meat. You couldn't hurry smoking. Cold smoking a ham properly might take a month. You couldn't speed up fermentation beyond its natural pace. Root vegetables needed to be checked regularly, any spoiled ones removed before they affected the others. Making jam required hours at the stove, stirring, watching, testing. There were no shortcuts, no fast-forward button. Just time, patience, and careful attention. So settle in now. Get comfortable, perhaps you're lying in bed, ready to drift off to sleep. The lights are dim. Your pillow is perfectly arranged. You're warm and safe and comfortable. Perhaps you're simply looking to unwind after a long day. Maybe you're sitting in a chair or lying on a couch, just letting your mind wander. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, let yourself relax. Let your breathing slow. Let your muscles unclench. Let your mind ease away from the stresses and concerns of modern life. Let yourself drift into another time. A time when life moved slower, when food was more precious, when the rhythm of the seasons dictated everything. What you ate, when you ate it, how you prepared it, how you preserved it for the months ahead. Close your eyes if you like. Picture smoke curling up from a small building, perfuming the autumn air with the scent of hickory and apple wood. Picture rows of jars gleaming on cellar shelves, filled with jewel-coloured jams and pickles. Picture a root cellar carved into a hillside, cool and dark, lined with crates of potatoes and apples. Picture barrels of salt pork in a stone-floored pantry. Picture strings of onions hanging from rafters, braided together, slowly drying and curing. We have all the time in the world tonight. There is no rush, no hurry, no pressure. Just the gentle unfolding of techniques and traditions that kept humanity fed for millennia. Stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Not extraordinary in the sense of dramatic or exciting. These were slow, patient, methodical tasks. But extraordinary in their importance, in their ingenuity, in their effectiveness. Let us begin our journey. Let us explore how people preserved food before refrigeration. Let us discover the patience, the skill, the careful knowledge that turned perishable harvests into food that could last through winter, through voyages, through lean times. Take a deep breath, let it out slowly, and let us begin. To understand why people went to such extraordinary lengths to preserve food, we first need to understand the enemy they were fighting: spoilage, decay, rot, the inevitable march of decomposition that begins the moment any living thing dies. Let's start with something simple: an apple. Picture a perfect apple, hanging from a tree on a crisp autumn day. The skin is taut and glossy. The flesh inside is firm and crisp, full of juice and flavour. The apple is alive, in a sense. It is respiring, taking in oxygen, releasing carbon dioxide. It is receiving nutrients from the tree through the stem. Cells are functioning, maintaining themselves, keeping everything in order. Now imagine you pick that apple, you twist it gently, and it comes free from the branch with a satisfying snap. In that moment, everything changes. The apple is no longer receiving nutrients from the tree. It is cut off from its source of water, of minerals, of energy. It begins immediately to break down. At first, the changes are imperceptible. The apple looks exactly the same. It tastes the same. For hours, even for days, you might not notice any difference, but changes are happening nonetheless. The cells are no longer being maintained. Chemical processes are shifting from growth and maintenance to decay. Bacteria are everywhere. This is important to understand. Bacteria are not just in obviously dirty places. They're in the air you breathe, on every surface you touch, on your skin, in your mouth, on the surface of that apple, even while it was hanging on the tree. Everywhere, thousands of species, trillions upon trillions of individual organisms, all microscopic, all invisible, but all very much present. Most of these bacteria are harmless. Many are even beneficial. But some, given the right conditions, can cause decay, can break down organic matter, can turn fresh food into rotting, putrid waste. These bacteria are constantly searching for food, for energy, for the resources they need to survive and multiply. And dead organic matter, fruits, vegetables, meat, fish, provides exactly what they need. Sugars, proteins, fats, all the complex molecules that make up living things become food for bacteria once those things die. At room temperature, bacteria multiply with astonishing, almost terrifying speed. A single bacterium divides into two. This process, called binary fission, can happen very quickly, sometimes as fast as every 20 minutes under ideal conditions. 2 bacteria become 4, 4 become 8, 8 becomes 16. The growth is exponential, not linear. Let's do some quick mathematics. Start with 1 bacterium. After 20 minutes, you have 2. After 40 minutes, 4. After an hour, 8. After 2 hours, 64. After 4 hours, over 4,000. After 8 hours, a single workday, over 16 million. After 12 hours, over 68 billion. All from one single bacterium. Of course, conditions are rarely ideal. Bacteria run out of nutrients. They compete with each other. They produce waste that inhibits further growth. But even accounting for these limitations, the growth is remarkable. Within hours, a food item can go from having a small bacterial population to having an enormous one. As bacteria consume and break down food, they produce waste products. Just like any living thing, bacteria take in nutrients and excrete waste. Some of these waste products are harmless, carbon dioxide for instance, water, but others are not harmless at all. Some bacterial waste products are toxic to humans. Some cause foul odors. The smell of rotting meat is largely the smell of bacterial waste products. Compounds with names like putrescine and cadaverine, which smell exactly as unpleasant as their names suggest. Hydrogen sulfide, which smells like rotten egg. Various organic acids and amines, each contributing their own notes to the symphony of rot. This is why spoiled food makes us sick, why the smell of rotting meat triggers such strong reactions of revulsion and disgust. Our bodies have evolved very sensitive detection systems for spoiled food. Our noses can detect certain compounds associated with decay at incredibly low concentrations. Our sense of taste rejects foods that have begun to spoil. Our disgust response, that visceral feeling of revulsion, is a protective mechanism, keeping us from eating things that might harm or kill us. But before refrigeration, before modern preservation techniques, before our current abundance, avoiding spoilage wasn't as simple as throwing away the bad and buying more. When your winter survival depended on the meat you butchered in autumn, when your protein for the year came from the pigs you raised and the fish you caught, you couldn't afford to lose it to rot. You couldn't just go to the store and buy more. There was no store. There was no more until next year's harvest, next year's slaughter, next year's catch. Different foods spoil at different rates. This is important to understand. Some foods are extremely perishable. Others last longer naturally. Fresh fish, for instance, is notoriously quick to turn. The flesh of fish is delicate, easily broken down. Fish caught in the morning might be questionable by evening, especially in warm weather. Within 24 hours without preservation, fresh fish is almost certainly spoiled. The eyes cloud over, the gills darken, the flesh softens and begins to separate from the bones. The smell changes from the clean, fresh scent of the sea to something sour and ammoniated. Meat lasts somewhat longer, but not much. A piece of beef or pork, kept at room temperature, might be acceptable for a day, perhaps 2 in cool weather. But beyond that, decay is obvious. The surface becomes slimy. The colour darkens and turns uneven. The smell becomes off, then clearly bad. Flies arrive and lay eggs. The meat begins to rot from the surface inward. Poultry spoils even faster than red meat. Chicken or duck, unless preserved, lasts perhaps a day at room temperature. The flesh is delicate, the bacterial load often high. Within hours of slaughter, if not cooled or preserved, poultry begins to turn. Milk sours within a day or 2 at room temperature. Fresh milk is delicious, nutritious, but extremely perishable. The bacteria naturally present in milk, even clean, fresh milk, begin multiplying immediately. They consume the lactose, the milk sugar, and produce lactic acid. This acid causes the milk proteins to coagulate, to curdle. The milk thickens, sours, separates. What was sweet and pleasant becomes sour and undrinkable. Eggs last longer than milk or meat, but they too eventually spoil. The shell provides some protection, but it is porous. Air and bacteria can penetrate. Over weeks, the egg deteriorates. The white becomes thin and watery. The yolk weakens and may break. Eventually, gases build up inside. A truly rotten egg is unmistakable. When cracked open, the smell is immediate and overwhelming. Bread grows moldy within a week, sometimes less. The spores of bread mold are everywhere, floating in the air, landing on surfaces. On fresh bread, they find ideal conditions, moisture, nutrients, a comfortable temperature. They germinate, sending out thread, like hyphae that spread through the bread. Soon, visible colonies appear, fuzzy patches of blue-green or white or black. The mold penetrates deep into the loaf, far beyond what is visible on the surface. Even foods we think of as relatively stable have their limits. Grains can be infested by weevils and other insects. These pests lay eggs in stored grain. The larvae hatch and consume the grain from inside. A barrel of wheat that seemed perfectly fine in autumn might be riddled with insects by spring. Mice and rats are attracted to stored grains as well, consuming them, contaminating them with droppings and urines. Apples eventually rot. Left at room temperature, they might last a few weeks, but eventually brown spots appear. The flesh softens, the skin wrinkles. The decay spreads inward from these spots. Fungi take hold. The apple becomes mealy, then mushy, then obviously rotten. Carrots go soft and sprouted. Potatoes sprout and shrivel. Onions rot from the inside out. The outer layers might look fine while the center turns to soft, foul-smelling mush. Cabbage wilts and then blackens with decay. Leafy vegetables wilt within hours, then turn slimy within days. Nothing lasts forever without intervention. This is the fundamental problem that humans had to solve. How do you make food last? How do you turn something that will spoil in days into something that will last weeks, months, even years? The answer, arrived at independently by cultures around the world, was to manipulate the conditions bacteria need to thrive. Remove moisture, and bacteria struggle to survive and multiply. Add salt, and you create an environment hostile to their growth. Expose food to smoke, and you coat it in compounds that inhibit bacterial activity. Cool food sufficiently, and bacterial activity slows dramatically. Create an acidic environment, and most harmful bacteria cannot survive. None of these methods stop decay completely. Nothing short of sterile canning, a relatively modern invention, achieves true shelf stability at room temperature. But these traditional methods slow decay dramatically. They buy time. They turn days into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. For a farming family in medieval Europe, this made the difference between eating through the winter and starving before spring. For a ship's crew on a months-long voyage, it meant the difference between scurvy and health, between life and death. For a hunter thousands of years ago, it meant the difference between a few days of feasting and weeks of sustained nutrition. The problem of spoilage shaped human history in ways we rarely consider today. It determined where people could live. Abundant food sources meant nothing if the food couldn't be preserved. It influenced what people ate. Preservation methods work better for some foods than others. So preserved foods became staples, while perishable foods remained rare treats. It shaped trade routes. Salt was so valuable precisely because it preserved food. Trade in salt, in salted fish, in preserved meats. These were major economic activities. Wars were fought over salt deposits. Cities grew up around salt mines and salt works. It influenced military campaigns. Armies needed preserved food. An army marches on its stomach, as Napoleon supposedly said. The ability to preserve and transport food determined how far armies could travel, how long they could campaign. Preserved food, salt pork, hardtack, dried peas, sustained soldiers for centuries. It affected patterns of settlement. People chose where to live partly based on preservation conditions. Cool climates favoured certain preservation methods, dry climates others. Access to salt, to good soil for root cellars, to forests for smokehouses. All these influenced where people settled and thrived. The problem of spoilage was, quite simply, one of the fundamental challenges of human existence. And the solutions people developed, the techniques we're about to explore in detail, are beautiful in their simplicity and effectiveness. They required no electricity, no complex machinery, no modern chemistry. Just time, patience, natural materials, and a deep understanding of natural processes. In the hours ahead, we'll explore these solutions one by one. We'll start with perhaps the oldest and most important preservative known to humanity, salt. Salt, sodium chloride. Those small white crystals you sprinkle on your food without a second thought, probably sitting in a shaker on your table right now. So common and cheap that you might have several containers of it in your home and never think twice about the cost. In our modern world, salt is nothing special. It is abundant, inexpensive, unremarkable. A container of salt at the grocery store might cost $1 or $2. You use it freely without concern, without even thinking about it. You salt your pasta water. You salt your vegetables. You might even salt the rim of a cocktail glass, or salt your driveway in winter. It is everywhere, available, cheap. But for most of human history, salt was precious, valuable, sometimes literally worth its weight in gold, or close to it. The word salary comes from salt. Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt rations, salarium, or given money specifically to buy salt. The phrase, worth his salt, refers to this compensation. Someone worth their salt was someone valuable enough to deserve their salt ration, their salary. Wars were fought over salt deposits. Cities grew up around salt mines and salt works. Trade routes were established specifically to move salt from sources to markets. In some societies, salt was used as currency. Entire economies revolved around this simple mineral, mining it, producing it, transporting it, trading it. Why? Because salt preserves food like almost nothing else. In a world without refrigeration, salt was survival. A family with sufficient salt could preserve their harvest, their meat, their fish. A family without salt faced starvation. It is that fundamental, that essential, that valuable. The mechanism by which salt preserves food is elegantly simple. Bacteria, like all living things, need water to survive. Not just water around them, but water available to them, free water that their cells can use. Salt, through a process called osmosis, draws this water out. Imagine a bacterial cell on the surface of a piece of meat. The cell is full of water. Bacteria are mostly water, just like most living things. The cell membrane is semi-permeable, meaning water can pass through it, but many other substances cannot. When you cover that meat with salt, you create a concentration gradient. Outside the cell, there is a very high concentration of salt. Inside the cell, there is very little salt. Water moves from areas of low salt concentration to areas of high salt concentration, trying to equalize the difference. So water is pulled out of the bacterial cell. As water leaves the cell shrinks. Its internal processes stop functioning. Eventually it dies. Or at best, it enters a dormant state where it cannot multiply, cannot carry out the processes that would cause food to decay. The salt doesn't just inhibit bacterial growth. At high enough concentrations, it actively kills bacteria. Salt also draws water out of the food itself. A piece of meat heavily salted loses much of its moisture. This dehydration creates an environment where bacteria cannot thrive. Even if some bacteria survive the direct effects of salt, they cannot multiply in the dried, salty environment. People discovered this property of salt thousands of years ago. We don't know exactly when, or where, or how. Perhaps someone noticed that meat stored near salt deposits lasted longer. Perhaps coastal peoples noticed that fish washed up on salty shores didn't decay as quickly. However, it was discovered, the knowledge spread, and the technique evolved, becoming one of the primary methods of food preservation across virtually every culture. Archaeological evidence suggests salt curing dates back at least to ancient Egypt, probably much earlier. The ancient Egyptians used salt in mummification, preserving human bodies for the afterlife. They certainly knew its preservative properties, and almost certainly used it for food as well. Ancient Roman texts describe salt preservation in detail. Ancient Chinese sources mention it. Every ancient civilization that had access to salt used it for preservation. Let's walk through the process of salt curing meat in detail. Imagine you're a farmer in, say, 17th century England. It is autumn. November, perhaps. The leaves have fallen. The ground is hardening with the first frosts. The air is crisp and cold. This is the time for slaughter. You can't keep all your animals through winter. You don't have enough hay, enough grain to feed them all. During the growing season, animals could graze on pasture, finding their own food. But now the pasture is dead and brown. Everything must be fed from your stores. So you've made calculations. How many animals can you feed through winter? How many should you slaughter now? You've decided to slaughter several pigs. Pigs are ideal for preservation. They produce a lot of fat, which helps keep the meat moist and flavorful, and every part can be used. Nothing is wasted. The slaughter itself is a serious undertaking. It is done quickly, as humanely as possible. The pig is stunned, then its throat is cut. The blood drains into containers. Even blood is saved, to be made into blood pudding. The pig is scalded in hot water to make removing the bristles easier. Then the careful work of butchering begins. This is skilled work, requiring knowledge of anatomy, practice, sharp knives, steady hands. You separate the carcass into primal cuts. The hams, the rear legs, are carefully removed. These are premium cuts, substantial pieces of meat that will be treated with special care. The belly becomes bacon. The shoulders can be cured whole or divided. The ribs, the loin, the various smaller cuts, each is considered carefully. Some meat you'll set aside for immediate consumption. Fresh pork is a treat, a luxury, and your family will eat well for several days. Roasted pork, pork chops, pork tenderloin, foods you'll rarely enjoy once the fresh meat is gone, but you can only eat so much in a few days. The vast majority needs to be preserved. You've prepared for this. You've purchased salt, a significant expense. Several pounds of salt, maybe 20 or 30 pounds, depending on how much meat you need to preserve. In earlier centuries, you might have made the salt yourself, boiling seawater in large pans, collecting the crystals left behind after the water evaporates. Coastal peoples did this for millennia. Or perhaps you've obtained salt from a salt mine, rock salt, halite, dug from the earth and crushed. However you've obtained it, you have it now, and it represents a significant portion of your annual expenses. You have choices in how to cure the meat. Some people use dry salt exclusively. Others make a brine, salt dissolved in water. Each method has advantages and disadvantages. Dry salting is simpler in some ways but requires more salt. Brining is more economical with salt but takes more time and care. Let's say you choose dry salting for the hams. These are large, substantial pieces of meat, and you want them to last. You want them to still be good in the spring, maybe even into the next summer. You take a large wooden barrel, clean and dry. The wood itself should be clean but not new. New wood might impart flavors. Oak is traditional, though other hardwoods work as well. You sprinkle a generous layer of salt across the bottom. Not just a light dusting, a real layer, perhaps half an inch thick. Then you take your first ham. It is a large piece of meat, maybe 20 pounds. You might have rubbed it with more salt first, working the salt into every surface, into the cavity where the bone was removed if you've boned it, into any crevices or folds. Then you lay it in the barrel on that bed of salt. More salt now. You cover the ham completely. Not just a sprinkle on top. You're burying it in salt. You pour salt over it, pack salt around it, ensure every surface is in contact with salt. The salt should be an inch thick over the top, more in the gaps. Then the next piece of meat, another ham or perhaps a shoulder or large piece of belly for bacon. More salt underneath, the meat laid down, more salt covering it completely. Layer after layer, salt, meat, salt, meat, salt, meat. Each piece completely surrounded by salt, insulated from the others, protected. The barrel fills. When it is full, you add one more good layer of salt on top. Then you cover the barrel, not airtight. Some air circulation is actually helpful, but covered to keep out dust, insects, any contamination. Now the waiting begins. The salt immediately starts working. Within minutes, you'd see moisture beginning to appear if you looked inside. The salt is drawing water from the meat through osmosis. The surface of the meat in contact with salt is being penetrated by the salt, which dissolves in the drawn moisture and soaks in. Within hours, liquid is pooling at the bottom of the barrel. This is brine, created by the salt dissolving in the water pulled from the meat. Some of this brine might drain away if you've left a small hole in the bottom of the barrel for this purpose. Or you might periodically open the barrel and drain it off, then add more dry salt. The meat begins to change. The color shifts from the pink red of fresh pork to something darker, grayer. The texture becomes firmer. The surface in contact with salt becomes dry and slightly crusty. This process continues for weeks. The salt works slowly but thoroughly, penetrating deeper and deeper into the meat. In the first few days, it penetrates the outer layers. Over the following weeks, it works its way toward the center. For a large ham, complete curing might take 6 weeks or even 2 months. You check periodically. Once a week, perhaps, you open the barrel. You look at the meat, checking for any signs of spoilage, though properly salted meat rarely spoils. You might rearrange the pieces, moving bottom ones to the top, ensuring even curing. You might add more salt if it seems needed. You drain off any excess brine that is accumulated. Slowly, the transformation completes. The meat becomes salt pork, or in the case of the hams, salt ham. The moisture content has dropped dramatically. What was perhaps 70% water is now 40 or 50%. The salt content is high throughout. The environment is hostile to bacteria. This meat will now last for months, a year or more if kept cool and dry. Through the winter, through the spring, possibly into the next autumn, you can store the barrel in a cool cellar or pantry. When you need meat, you open the barrel, remove a piece, close it back up. The rest continues to cure, continues to be preserved. Before cooking salt, cured meat, you'll need to prepare it. It is very salty, too salty to eat directly for most palates, so you soak it. You take your piece of salt pork or salt ham, and you place it in fresh water, cold water. You let it soak for hours, even overnight, changing the water periodically. The salt leaches out of the meat into the water. The water becomes very salty. You pour it off, add fresh water, continue soaking. After sufficient soaking, the meat is ready to cook. It is still flavorful, still has salt, but it is no longer overwhelmingly salty. You might boil it, making the meat tender and using the cooking liquid for soup. You might fry slices of it, creating a savory, rich dish. You might add it to beans or other dishes where it provides both protein and flavor. The flavor is different from fresh meat. Distinctly different. The long curing changes the flavor, developing deep, complex notes. It is savory intense, with that particular taste that comes from cured pork. Modern ham, the kind you buy in a store, is a distant echo of this. Real salt cured ham, made the old way, has a depth and intensity that modern products rarely match. The same basic process works for fish. Cod, in particular, was famously preserved this way for centuries. Salt cod bacalhau in Spanish and Portuguese, bacalhau in Portuguese, moru in French, became a staple of European and colonial American diets. The fishing boats would head out to the Grand Banks or other rich fishing grounds. They'd catch cod, sometimes hundreds or thousands of pounds of cod. On the boat, they'd immediately begin processing. The cod would be cleaned, gutted, often split open, and the backbone removed. Then they'd layer it with salt in barrels, just like pork, or spread it on deck with salt and let it begin to cure in the open air before packing it. This allowed fishing boats to stay out for weeks or months. The catch was preserved as it was caught. When the hold was full of salted fish, they'd return to port. The salt cod would be offloaded, further dried if necessary, then sold and shipped far inland, far from any coast. People hundreds of miles from the ocean could have fish, preserved fish, thanks to salt. Salt cod requires extensive soaking before use, even more than salt pork. It might need to soak for a full day or more, with multiple water changes, to become palatable. But once soaked and properly prepared, it is the basis for countless traditional dishes. Portuguese bacalhau dishes number in the hundreds. Italian bacalhau, Caribbean saltfish, all based on this ancient preservation technique. We'll pause here for a moment, let that image settle in your mind. Barrels of salt pork in a cool cellar. Fish laid out on racks covered in salt, slowly curing. The patient work of preservation. The knowledge that these stores would sustain a family through winter. The security that came from having food that wouldn't spoil, food that would last. When we return, we'll explore another preservation method, one that fills the air with fragrant smoke and takes even more patience, the art of smoking food. If you've ever walked past a barbecue restaurant, you know that smell, wood smoke, rich, savory, somehow both sharp and comforting at once. That smell represents another ancient preservation technique, one that combines multiple preservation mechanisms into a single, patient process. Smoking. Smoking works through several mechanisms at once. The smoke itself contains hundreds of chemical compounds, many of which are antimicrobial. They inhibit bacterial growth. Compounds like formaldehyde, various phenols, organic acids. These settle onto the surface of the food and penetrate into it, creating an environment hostile to bacteria. The heat from smoking also drives moisture out of food. Not high heat like roasting or grilling, but gentle, sustained heat over many hours or days. This dehydration creates a drier environment on the surface and throughout the food where bacteria struggle to survive and multiply. The smoke also deposits a protective coating on the food's surface. A thin pellicle forms, a tacky, slightly shiny layer that seals the food against the air, against contamination. This pellicle is more than just cosmetic. It is an actual barrier, a shield, but smoking done properly isn't quick. Not at all. A truly smoked piece of meat might spend days, even weeks, in a smokehouse. The process is slow, patient, methodical. Exactly the kind of process we appreciate here. No rush, no hurry, just time and smoke and patient attention. Let's imagine we're in a medieval smokehouse. Picture the structure first. It is a small building, perhaps 10 feet by 10 feet, maybe 12 feet tall. The walls are wood fitted together tightly to hold smoke. The roof is also wood, peaked to shed rain. There is a door, solid and well fitted, with a good latch. At the top, near the peak of the roof, there is a vent. a simple opening that can be opened wider or closed partially to control airflow. You open the door and step inside. The smell hits you immediately. Old smoke absorbed into the wood over years or decades. It is not unpleasant. There is something almost sweet about it, mixed with the savory smell of cured meat. Your eyes adjust to the dimness. Light filters in through gaps in the walls, through the open vent above. Inside, you see racks, wooden poles spanning the space at different heights. Sturdy poles, well supported, because they'll be holding significant weight. Hanging from these racks are pieces of meat. Hams, their hooks embedded in the thick part of the meat. Bacon cut into slabs, each slab hanging from a string looped through a hole near one end. Sausages, linked together, draped over the poles. Maybe some fish too, split and spread open, hanging from smaller sticks threaded through their flesh. Below, at ground level, is the fire pit. But calling it a fire pit doesn't quite capture what it is. It is not meant for flame. It is a shallow depression, perhaps lined with brick or stone, filled now with smouldering coals and wood chips. There is barely any flame, just a few small licks of fire here and there. Mostly it is glowing coals with thick white smoke rising from them. You don't want flame. Fire means heat, and while some heat is acceptable, even desirable for hot smoking, too much heat cooks the meat rather than curing it. And for cold smoking, for true preservation smoking, you want the temperature to stay below about 90 degrees Fahrenheit. That means just enough heat to generate smoke, but not enough to cook. The type of wood matters enormously. Different woods produce different flavors, different qualities of smoke. Hickory is traditional in many regions, particularly in America. It gives a strong, hearty taste, robust and assertive. Oak is more subtle, dependable, traditional in Europe. Applewood is milder, slightly sweet, prized for pork and poultry. Maple, cherry, pecan, each has its own character. Some woods are unsuitable. Pine and other resinous woods produce sooty smoke with an unpleasant turpentine. Like flavor, they can ruin meat, making it bitter and off-tasting. You want hardwoods, preferably seasoned, dry enough to burn cleanly, but not so dry they flame up easily. You tend this fire with great care. Every few hours you check it. The coals are covered with wood chips or sawdust. Not large logs, those would create too much heat, too much flame. Small chips, or sawdust, or small pieces of wood. They're scattered over the coals, where they smoulder rather than burning. You adjust the airflow carefully. The door might be left slightly ajar, or completely closed. The vent at the top might be wide open, or partially closed with a board. You're managing the oxygen supply. Too much oxygen and the fire flames up. The temperature rises. The wood burns too fast. Too little, and the fire goes out. You want that perfect state of slow combustion, where the wood smoulders steadily, producing thick clouds of smoke that rise and swirl through the racks of hanging meat. The smoke rises naturally, hot air rises, and even the modest heat from the smouldering wood is enough to create an updraft. The smoke swirls around the hanging meat, enveloping it, before slowly escaping through the vent at the top. The whole smokehouse fills with it. If you were to open the door while the fire is going strong, smoke would pour out, thick and white and fragrant. The meat changes gradually, so gradually that hour to hour you might not notice. But day to day, the changes are obvious. Fresh pink pork slowly darkens to tan, then to a deeper brown, eventually to deep mahogany if you smoke it long enough. The surface becomes dry, slightly leathery. That pellicle forms, giving the surface a slight sheen. The color becomes even uniform. If you're smoking fish, salmon perhaps, the transformation is equally dramatic. Fresh salmon is orange, pink, moist, with a soft texture. After a day of smoking, it is beginning to darken. The surface is drying. After several days, it is deep copper, almost bronze. The surface is firm and dry. The flesh has changed texture entirely. The smoke penetrates the meat, carrying its preservative compounds deep into the tissue. At first, the smoke flavor is only on the surface, but given time, days, weeks, it penetrates deeper. The flavor changes too, taking on that characteristic smoky taste we associate with bacon, with smoked fish, with barbecue. It is a flavor that can't be replicated any other way. Liquid smoke tries, but it is not the same. Real smoke from real wood, smouldering for days, creates something unique. The time required depends on several factors. The size of the meat matters. A large ham takes much longer than a small fish. The intensity of the smoke matters. More smoke speeds the process. The desired result matters. Meat meant to last a full year requires more smoking than meat you plan to eat in a few months. A ham meant to be kept for a year might hang in the smokehouse for a month or more. Every day or every few days you light the fire. You tend it through the day, adding more wood chips as needed. In the evening you might let it die down, or you might maintain a very low level of smoke through the night. Morning comes, you rebuild the fire, add more chips, continue the process. During this time, you maintain the smoke almost constantly, or at least very regularly. It becomes a rhythm, a routine part of your day. Morning, check the smokehouse, light the fire. Midday, check the fire, add more chips. Evening, check again, adjust the airflow for the night. This continues day after day, week after week. Some smokehouses are specifically designed for cold smoking. These keep temperatures very low, below 90 degrees, sometimes below 80 degrees. They might be built with the fire pit physically separated from the smoking chamber. The smoke travels through a short tunnel or pipe before entering the chamber, cooling as it travels. This allows smoking even in warm weather without cooking the meat. Cold smoking is true preservation smoking. The goal is not to cook the meat at all, but to dry it and flavor it and preserve it. This takes longer but produces meat that will last for many months without refrigeration. A cold smoked country ham is a thing of beauty, dark, dry, intensely flavored. It will hang in a cool pantry for a year and only improve with age. Hot smoking, by contrast, brings temperatures up higher, maybe 150 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. This partially cooks the meat while smoking it. The meat comes out ready to eat, but it won't last as long. Hot smoked fish might last a few weeks. Hot smoked ribs or brisket, like modern barbecue, should be eaten within days. But for preservation, for making meat last through winter, cold smoking is the way. The patient application of cool smoke over many days, drying the meat, flavoring it, preserving it. Fish are particularly well suited to smoking. Oily fish, especially salmon, mackerel, herring. The oils in these fish carry the smoke flavor beautifully. They also help keep the fish from becoming too dry during the smoking process. The process for smoking fish is similar to smoking meat, though often quicker because fish are smaller and more delicate. A whole salmon might be smoked for a day or two for hot smoking, or a week or more for cold smoking. Smaller fish like herring might be done in just hours for hot smoking, or a few days for cold smoking. In Scotland and Scandinavia, smoked fish was a dietary staple for centuries. Every coastal village would have smokehouses. The catch would be processed immediately, cleaned, sometimes split or filleted, then hung in the smokehouse. The smell of smoking fish would be ever present in these villages, as normal and unremarkable as the smell of the sea itself. In North America, indigenous peoples perfected techniques for smoking salmon that go back thousands of years. They would build smokehouses from cedar, which added its own aromatic qualities to the smoke. Inside, they'd hang split salmon, butterflied opened like a book, the bones removed or left in depending on preference. The wood used for smoking was often alder, which produces a light, slightly sweet smoke that complements salmon perfectly. These traditions weren't written down, they were learned by doing, by watching, by participating. A child would help prepare fish for smoking, learning how to split them properly, would help tend the fire, learning the difference between good smoke and bad, would learn to judge when the fish was sufficiently smoked by color, by texture, by feel. This knowledge, accumulated over generations, was passed down through demonstration and practice. The combination of salting and smoking was particularly effective for preservation. Often meat would be cured first, as we described in the previous chapter, then smoked. The salt drew out moisture and inhibited bacterial growth. Then the smoking added another layer of preservation, more flavor, and that protective coating. Traditional bacon is made exactly this way, pork belly cured in salt, then cold smoked. The result is something that will last for months without refrigeration. You can slice off what you need and the rest keeps. It is dry enough, and salty enough, and smoky enough that bacteria can't take hold. Mold might grow on the surface eventually, but you can simply cut it off. The meat beneath is fine. Building and maintaining a smokehouse was serious business. The structure had to be well built, with good seals to hold smoke, but adequate venting to prevent dangerous buildup of creosote and to control temperature. The fire pit needed to be designed carefully, positioned properly, safe enough that it wouldn't burn down the building. Racks had to be strong enough to hold hundreds of pounds of hanging meat, positioned to allow smoke circulation around each piece. Some farm families would butcher their pigs in late autumn, around the first frost. The timing was important, cool enough that flies weren't a problem, but before the deep cold of winter set in. The meat would be salted immediately, packed in barrels, left to cure for several weeks. Then, in midwinter, the cured meat would be transferred to the smokehouse. By late winter or early spring, they'd have a smokehouse full of preserved pork, hams hanging from every available space, sides of bacon, sausages looped over poles. All of it smoked, preserved, ready to sustain the family until the next autumn. This meat wouldn't be eaten fresh, of course. It was heavily processed, very smoky, quite salty, dry. Before cooking, you'd often soak it in water like salt pork to remove excess salt. Then it might be boiled, which rehydrates it somewhat and makes it tender, or fried, where the rendered fat and the crispy edges are delicious, or used to flavour soups and stews, where a small amount of smoked meat flavours a large pot of food. The texture was different from fresh meat, denser, chewier. The flavour was intense. You didn't need much to get that rich, smoky, meaty taste. A small piece of smoked pork could flavour a whole pot of beans. A bit of smoked fish could season a soup or stew. In warmer climates, where spoilage was an even greater threat, smoking was especially important. Salt and smoke together provided the best preservation available. In coastal areas, particularly in the tropics, fishing fleets would smoke their catch daily or even process it on the boat. In rural areas, any hunted game, deer, wild boar, rabbits, would be smoked to preserve it. The romance of smoking, if we can call it that, lies in its beautiful simplicity. Fire, wood, meat, time. Nothing more is needed. No complex equipment, no expensive supplies beyond the wood itself. Just patience and attention and the willingness to tend the fire day after day. And the result is something truly remarkable. A piece of meat transformed from something that would spoil in days into something that will last for months. All through the patient application of smoke, through the careful tending of smouldering coals, through the passage of time. If you've ever smoked meat yourself, and many people still do in backyard smokers, in small home operations, you know something of this patience. The satisfaction of checking your smoker after 24 hours and seeing the meat taking on that perfect mahogany colour. The way time seems to stretch out, unhurried, while the smoke does its work. The smell that permeates everything, that clings to your clothes and hair, that becomes part of your memory of the process. For people in the past, this wasn't a hobby or a weekend project, it was survival, pure and simple. But I like to think they found satisfaction in it too, in the rhythm of tending the fires, in the knowledge that they were transforming perishable meat into preserved food, in the security that came from looking at those racks full of smoked hams and bacon, knowing that hunger would be kept at bay for another season. Perhaps the simplest preservation method of all is also one of the oldest, possibly the very first preservation technique humans ever discovered: drying. Simply removing water from food makes it inhospitable to bacteria and mold, which need moisture to grow and multiply. And the simplest way to remove water, requiring no fuel, no equipment, no special materials, is to let the sun and wind do the work. Imagine a warm summer day in a Mediterranean climate, perhaps southern Italy or Greece or Spain. The sky is clear, brilliant blue, stretching from horizon to horizon without a single cloud. The sun beats down, intense and warm. The temperature is in the 80s, perhaps low 90s. A gentle breeze flows, carrying the scent of herbs and dry earth. Perfect conditions for drying food. Ideal conditions, in fact. In a courtyard, or in a garden, or perhaps on a flat rooftop, you've laid out racks covered with produce. These racks are simple wooden frames with cloth stretched across them, or woven mats, or even just clean boards. They're positioned in full sun, angled perhaps to maximize exposure, raised off the ground to allow air circulation underneath. On these racks, tomatoes, sliced in half and laid cut side up, the seeds and juice visible, glistening in the sunlight. Grapes whole, spread in a single layer, each grape perfect and round. Figs split open to reveal their seeded interiors, the pink flesh exposed to the sun and air. Apricots and peaches, halved and pitted, arranged carefully to maximize sun exposure while minimizing overlap. Plums treated the same way. The sun beats down on them. The breeze flows over them, and very, very slowly, the water evaporates. This isn't a quick process. An hour passes, and the fruit looks almost unchanged. Perhaps the cut surfaces of the tomatoes look slightly less wet. Perhaps the grapes are fractionally less taut. But these changes are subtle, barely noticeable. By the end of the day, after 8 or 10 hours of intense sun, the changes are more obvious. The tomatoes have started to shrink, their edges beginning to curl slightly. The grapes are starting to wrinkle. The figs and stone fruits look somewhat deflated, the flesh no longer plump and juicy, but beginning to look slightly withered. This is just the beginning. A tomato might take several days to dry completely depending on conditions. 3, 4, 5 days of intense sun. Grapes becoming raisins can take 2 weeks or more. Each morning you bring the racks out into the sun. Each evening, as the sun sets and the dew begins to form, you bring them inside. This protects them from moisture. Dew would undo the drying work, and also from nighttime pests. Throughout the day you check on them periodically. Turn them so they dry evenly. The top side might be drying faster than the bottom, so you flip them over, move them around on the racks if some areas are shadier than others. Inspect for any signs of spoilage or mold. If you catch these early, you can remove the affected piece before it spreads to others. As the days pass, the transformation becomes dramatic. Plump, juicy tomatoes slowly shrivel and concentrate. What was 90% water becomes 60%, then 40%, then 30% or less. The tomatoes flatten, their edges curl up. The flesh becomes darker and more intense in color. A fresh tomato is bright red. A sun-dried tomato is deep burgundy, almost brown, red, the color of old wine. The flavor intensifies dramatically as well. All the sugars, all the acids, all the complex compounds that give tomatoes their flavor. They're still there, but now they're concentrated. What was mild and fresh becomes rich, almost savory, with an intensity that is completely different from fresh. It is not better or worse, just different. Its own thing, entirely. Grapes undergo an equally dramatic change. Fresh grapes are translucent, taut with juice, their skins thin and delicate. As they dry, they lose their translucency. The skin darkens and toughens. The fruit shrinks dramatically. A dried grape is perhaps a quarter the size of a fresh one. They wrinkle, forming that characteristic raisin appearance. The sugars concentrate, becoming almost syrupy in their sweetness. The texture changes from crisp and juicy to chewy and dense. Figs and apricots and other stone fruits also transform. The fruit becomes chewy, sometimes almost leathery depending on how thoroughly it is dried. The flavor concentrates. Sweet becomes sweeter. Tart becomes more pronounced. The texture is completely different from fresh, not worse, not better, but its own unique thing. This transformation happens through simple physics and chemistry. Water molecules at the surface of the fruit absorb energy from the sun. This energy causes them to break free from the liquid state and become vapor. They evaporate. The breeze carries away this moisture-laden air, preventing saturation. More water migrates from the interior of the fruit to the surface, where it too evaporates. Gradually, steadily, the water content drops. At a certain level of dryness, bacteria and mold can't grow. Different organisms have different moisture requirements, but generally, once water content drops below about 20%, most organisms that cause spoilage can't survive. Enzymatic reactions that cause decay also slow dramatically at low moisture levels. The fruit is preserved, stable, and will remain edible for months, even years if stored properly. Different foods require different approaches to drying. Thin items like herbs can simply be hung in bunches in a dry, ventilated space. The leaves are thin enough that air circulation alone is sufficient. Within days or a week, the herbs are dry, brittle, ready to be crumbled and stored. Thicker items need to be sliced or split. A whole plum would take forever to dry and would likely rot before the inside dried sufficiently. But halved and pitted, it dries in a reasonable time. The same with apricots, peaches, larger tomatoes. Some foods benefit from pre-treatment. Grapes, for instance, have waxy skins that are water-resistant. Some people prick each grape with a needle before drying, breaking the skin and allowing moisture to escape more easily. Others dip them briefly in boiling water, which cracks the skin. These treatments speed drying significantly. Meat can be dried too, of course. Jerky is simply dried meat, and it has been made by cultures around the world for thousands of years, maybe tens of thousands of years. The process is similar to drying fruit but requires more care, as meat is more prone to spoilage and more potentially dangerous if it goes bad. To make jerky, you start with very lean meat. Fat doesn't dry well. Fat goes rancid when exposed to air and heat, so you want the leanest cuts possible with all visible fat trimmed away. Beef, venison, bison, any lean red meat works well. You slice the meat thinly, very thinly, perhaps a 1/4 inch thick, sometimes even thinner. You slice against the grain for the most tender result. Each slice should be uniform in thickness, so they all dry at the same rate. Often you'd marinate the meat first, at minimum. You'd salt it heavily. This draws out moisture and provides some preservation even before drying. You might add spices, herbs, maybe a bit of sugar. Some recipes call for smoking the meat briefly before drying, adding another layer of flavor and preservation. Then you lay out the slices or hang them. In hot, dry climates, meat can dry in the sun in just a day or two. You need to protect it from flies, perhaps covering it with cheesecloth or screening. You need to ensure good air circulation. You turn it periodically for even drying. The goal is meat that is completely dry, without any moist spots that could harbor bacteria. Properly dried jerky is somewhat brittle, leathery, very firm. It will snap if you bend it too far. There should be no give, no softness, no moisture when you squeeze it. Properly dried jerky will last for months without refrigeration. It is lightweight, portable, nutritious, perfect for travelers, for soldiers, for anyone who needed food that could be carried easily and wouldn't spoil. Plains indigenous peoples made pemmican, dried meat pounded into a powder, mixed with rendered fat, and sometimes dried berries packed into bags. Pemmican was extraordinarily nutrient, dense and could last for years. It sustained people through harsh winters and long journeys. Fish can be dried as well, and many coastal cultures perfected this technique. In Scandinavia, cod was dried on wooden racks called flakes, producing stockfish. Cod so thoroughly dried it became as hard as wood and could last for years. Before use, stockfish required extensive soaking, sometimes for days, and often pounding with a mallet to break it apart. But it provided protein far from the ocean, far from any fresh source. In warmer climates, fish drying had to be done very carefully to prevent spoilage before sufficient drying. Often fish would be salted first, heavily, then dried. The combination of salt and drying provided maximum preservation. In tropical regions where heat and humidity make preservation challenging, this combination of techniques was essential. The beautiful thing about sun drying is its absolute simplicity and universal accessibility. You need no special equipment, no fuel, no expensive supplies, just sun, air, and time. A farming family could preserve much of their harvest this way, transforming perishable fruits and vegetables into foods that would last through winter. In the Mediterranean, sun-dried tomatoes became a staple, a way to preserve the abundant summer tomato harvest for use in winter cooking. In the Middle East, dates and figs and apricots were dried in huge quantities, becoming trade goods, traveling along caravan routes, sustaining people across vast distances. In tropical climates, mangoes, bananas, coconut were dried. Each culture developed its own traditions, its own preferred foods and techniques. Some people built special drying structures. In some regions, you'll find traditional drying houses, structures with slatted sides to allow air circulation, with roofs to protect from rain, where foods could be dried in controlled conditions. Drying racks might be elaborate constructions, multiple levels, positioned to maximize sun exposure, but often people simply used whatever flat surfaces were available. Roofs. Flat roofs common in hot, dry climates are perfect for drying. Courtyard paving stones, wooden boards laid across supports. Anything that kept food off the ground, allowed air circulation, and exposed it to sun and breeze. At night, dew is the enemy. As temperatures drop, moisture condenses from the air onto surfaces. This dew would rehydrate dried or drying foods, undoing the day's work. So foods were often brought inside at night, then put out again in the morning. Or they were covered with cloth that breathed but kept dew off. Insects could be a problem too. Flies were especially attracted to drying meat and fish, drawn by the smell, seeking places to lay their eggs. Ants were attracted to sweet-dried fruits, so foods were protected, covered with fine screening or cheesecloth, monitored closely, any insects or larvae removed immediately. Despite these challenges, sun-drying remained one of the most important preservation methods for millennia. It required no resources beyond time and attention. It could be done by anyone, anywhere with sufficient sunshine. The only cost was the time spent preparing food, monitoring it, protecting it from pests and weather. Let's rest here for a moment. Let the image settle. Racks of tomatoes under the hot sun, strings of fish drying in coastal breeze, grapes slowly becoming raisins. The patient work of preservation through the simple act of removing water. The transformation from perishable to preserved through nothing more than sun and air and time. Not all preservation requires transformation. Sometimes the goal is simply to extend the life of fresh food by creating the right environment. And for countless generations, that environment was found underground, in cool cellars carved into the earth itself. Picture a root cellar. Not the dark, damp basement of a horror movie, with water, dripping and shadows lurking, but a purposeful, carefully designed space carved into the earth or built partially underground. A functional space, clean and organized, holding the winter's provisions. The entrance might be a sloped wooden door set into the ground, the kind that opens upward like a storm shelter, or perhaps stone steps descending from a farmhouse kitchen, worn smooth by generations of feet carrying food down and back up. You grasp the handle, wood or iron, cool to the touch, and open the door. Cool air rises to meet you immediately. Even in summer, even when the air above ground is warm and the sun is hot, down here it is cool, perhaps 55 degrees Fahrenheit. That perfect temperature where most vegetables keep well, cool enough to slow decay dramatically, but not so cold as to freeze. The air carries scents, earth, that deep, rich smell of soil, stone, if the walls are stone, wood from shelving and crates, and the foods themselves, the earthy smell of potatoes, the slightly sharp scent of onions, the subtle sweetness of apples. You descend the steps. They're steep, perhaps. Space is being conserved. The ceiling might be low, especially if this is an old cellar. You might have to duck slightly, or watch your head on beams. The walls as you descend might be earth, held back with stone or wood, or perhaps the whole cellar is lined with stone or brick, built to last generations. At the bottom, the space opens up, perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet, perhaps larger. Some root cellars were quite substantial, able to hold provisions for large families or even small communities. The floor might be packed earth or stone or brick. It is dry. A damp cellar is useless for storage, as dampness promotes rot. The walls are lined with shelves, dirty shelving, built to hold significant weight. Along these shelves, wooden crates filled with apples, each apple placed carefully so they're not touching. Baskets of potatoes, sorted by size, the largest ones for eating first as they won't keep as long. Canvas bags of onions, hung from hooks or laid in bins. Root vegetables, carrots, beets, turnips, parsnips, packed in boxes of damp sand. In one corner perhaps a bin of winter squash. Butternut, acorn, Hubbard, their hard shells protecting the flesh inside. Each squash placed with a bit of space around it, allowing air circulation. In another area, cabbages might be stored, either hung upside down by their roots or wrapped individually in newspaper. The principle behind root cellar storage is elegantly simple. Most of the biological processes that cause food to decay, respiration, enzymatic reactions, bacterial growth, occur more slowly at lower temperatures. These processes don't stop entirely until you reach deep freeze temperatures well below zero, but they slow significantly in the cool temperature range of a root cellar. A potato stored at 70 degrees Fahrenheit might last a few weeks before sprouting or rotting. That same potato at 55 degrees might last several months. The difference is dramatic, and it is the difference between having potatoes in January and running out in October. But temperature isn't the only factor. Humidity matters enormously. Different vegetables have different humidity requirements. Too dry, and many vegetables shrivel as they lose moisture through their skins. Carrots become limp and rubbery. Beets shrink. Even potatoes can lose moisture and become soft, too humid, and rot sets in. Moisture on surfaces promotes mold. Bacterial growth accelerates. A good root cellar maintains moderate humidity, around 60 to 80%. Not desert dry, not jungle. Wet but somewhere in between. The earth itself helps regulate this. Earth holds moisture, releasing it slowly into the air, but not so much that things become damp and moldy. Ventilation is also crucial. Fresh air circulation prevents several problems. It prevents the buildup of ethylene gas, which some fruits and vegetables produce as they ripen. Ethylene accelerates ripening in other produce. One apple producing ethylene can cause all nearby apples to ripen faster. Good ventilation carries this gas away. Ventilation also prevents stale, stagnant air that can promote mold growth. It provides fresh oxygen, which many vegetables need. They're still respiring, still breathing in a sense, even after harvest. And it prevents dangerous buildup of carbon dioxide. So a well-designed root cellar has vents, perhaps a low vent to bring in cool air and a high vent to let warm air escape. These vents might be simple pipes or ducts, sometimes with covers that can be opened or closed to regulate airflow. In winter, you might close them partially to retain warmth and prevent freezing. In autumn and spring, you might open them wider to increase circulation. Different vegetables have different storage requirements, and a good root cellar accommodates these differences. Potatoes like it cool and dark. Light causes them to turn green and develop solanine, a bitter and slightly toxic compound. So potatoes go in the darkest part of the cellar, perhaps covered with burlap or canvas to block any light. They need moderate humidity and good air circulation. Root vegetables, carrots, beets, turnips, parsnips, rutabagas store best when packed in damp sand. The sand prevents them from touching each other, which reduces rot spreading. It also maintains humidity around the vegetables, preventing them from shriveling. Layer of sand, layer of vegetables, layer of sand, layer of vegetables. The boxes or bins are then stored in the coolest part of the cellar. Onions and garlic prefer slightly drier conditions than root vegetables. Too much moisture causes them to rot or sprout, so they're often stored in mesh bags or braided together and hung, allowing air circulation all around them. They go in an area of the cellar with good ventilation and moderate humidity. Winter squash, pumpkins, butternut, acorn, Hubbard have hard skins that protect them well. They like it cool but not cold, and prefer it on the dry side. They're stored with space between each one, allowing air circulation and preventing any rot from spreading. A well-cured winter squash, stored properly, can last from October harvest all the way to March or April. Apples are interesting. They store remarkably well in cold conditions. A properly stored apple can last from October harvest to April or even May. But apples produce quite a bit of ethylene gas, more than most other fruits or vegetables, so they're often stored separately from other produce to prevent everything else from ripening too quickly. They're packed carefully in boxes, often wrapped individually in newspaper to prevent touching and to absorb any moisture. Cabbages can be stored several ways. They can be pulled up with their roots still attached and hung upside down in the cellar, or they can be wrapped individually in newspaper and stored on shelves. The newspaper absorbs excess moisture and helps prevent rot. Properly stored cabbage can last through winter into early spring. The tradition of root cellaring is ancient. As soon as humans began storing food, they realized that underground was cooler, more stable. The earth buffers temperature fluctuations. It stays cool in summer, relatively warm in winter. Archaeological evidence suggests that people have been using underground storage for thousands of years, possibly tens of thousands. In medieval Europe, most houses of any size had some form of cold storage. It might be a simple dirt, floored cellar beneath the house, accessed by a trapdoor in the kitchen floor. It might be a separate structure built into a hillside, taking advantage of the natural insulation of earth banked against the walls. Wealthy households might have elaborate underground complexes with multiple chambers for different types of storage. In North America, root cellars became essential on farms and homesteads. Many old farmhouses have root cellars built into their foundations. You can still see them today, though many are no longer used for their original purpose. Families would spend late autumn carefully storing their harvest, knowing that what they preserved now would determine how well they ate through the winter and early spring. Let's walk through the process of filling a root cellar for winter. It is late October, early November. The first hard frosts have come. The growing season is ending. Most crops have been harvested. Now comes the careful work of sorting and storing. You start with potatoes. You've dug them up over the past few weeks, carefully lifting each plant and collecting the tubers. You've let them dry briefly to cure the skins. This hardens the skin and helps them store better. Now you're sorting through them. Any damaged or bruised potatoes are set aside for immediate use. They won't store well. Any damage is a point where rot can enter. The perfect ones, firm and unblemished, go into wooden crates lined with newspaper or straw. These crates are carried down to the cellar, one by one, and stacked in the darkest corner, with space between crates for air circulation. Next, the root vegetables, carrots, beets, turnips. You've harvested them, twisted off the greens. Leaving the greens on would draw moisture from the roots. Now you pack them carefully in boxes or bins of sand. The sand should be damp but not wet. You can test it by squeezing a handful. It should clump together but not drip water. Layer of sand at the bottom, then a layer of carrots, arranged so they're not touching. Another layer of sand, completely covering the carrots. Another layer of carrots, and so on, until the box is full, with a final layer of sand on top. These boxes go to the coolest part of the cellar. Onions and garlic have been curing in a dry, airy space for several weeks already, their outer skins turning papery and protective. Now you braid them, a meditative process, 3 or 4 bulbs at a time, their dried leaves braided together into long ropes. Or you pack them loosely in mesh bags. These are hung from hooks or nails along one wall of the cellar, where air can circulate freely around them. The winter squash have been curing too, their skins hardening. You check each one carefully, looking for any soft spots, any damage. Even a small blemish can lead to rot during storage. Perfect squash are placed on shelves in the cellar. each one positioned so there is space around it, so it is not touching its neighbours. Cabbages, harvested with roots attached, are hung upside down from the ceiling beams, or they're wrapped individually in several layers of newspaper and arranged on shelves. The paper absorbs moisture, keeps them from touching, provides a protective layer. Apples are the last major storage crop. They've been picked carefully. Bruised apples don't store well. Each apple is wiped clean of any dirt or debris, then wrapped in newspaper and packed into wooden crates or boxes. Layer of apples, layer of newspaper between them. Another layer of apples. These go into their own area of the cellar, separated from other produce because of the ethylene gas they produce. With everything stored, you survey your work. The cellar is full, crates and boxes and bins of vegetables, hanging braids of onions, winter squash lined up on shelves, the abundance of autumn carefully preserved, ready to sustain you through winter into spring. Throughout the winter you visit the cellar regularly. Perhaps once a week you descend with a basket or bucket. You check the stored vegetables, looking for any signs of spoilage. Any potato that is soft, any apple with a brown spot, any onion that is slimy. These are removed immediately before the rot can spread to others. You select what you need for the coming week's meals. A few potatoes, some carrots and beets, an onion or two, maybe an apple for eating or baking. This weekly visit becomes a ritual, a connection to your stored food, a check on your provisions. There is something deeply satisfying about it. Descending into the cool darkness, lantern in hand, or switching on a light bulb if you have electricity, surveying your stores, knowing you have abundance, knowing you've prepared well, knowing that winter, harsh and long as it might be, will not leave you hungry. In spring, the cellar empties, the last withered potatoes, soft but still edible, the final sprouting onions, the wrinkled but still tasty apples from October's harvest, now in April or May, the carrots and beets perhaps starting to sprout but still usable. By late spring most of it is gone, just as the first fresh greens appear above ground. The cycle completes itself. Summer brings fresh food, autumn brings harvest and storage, winter brings careful consumption, spring brings renewal and the cellar's gradual emptying. Then the cellar is cleaned, aired out, prepared for the next season. The old sand from the root vegetable boxes is removed, replaced with fresh sand for next year. Shelves are swept. Any spoiled material is removed and composted. The space is left clean and dry, ready for the next autumn's harvest. We arrive now at one of the most versatile and enduring preservation methods, pickling, the transformation of vegetables and other foods through the power of acid. Pickling works because bacteria, like most living things, have a preferred pH range, a measure of acidity or alkalinity. Most harmful bacteria thrive in neutral to slightly alkaline conditions with pH around 6.5 to 7.5, make an environment acidic enough, with pH below 4.6, and most harmful bacteria cannot survive or multiply. This is why citrus juice doesn't spoil easily despite being moist and nutrient-rich, why vinegar is essentially indestructible, and why pickled foods can last for months or even years. There are two main approaches to pickling, two different ways of creating that acidic environment. One uses vinegar, acetic acid, added directly to the food. The other relies on fermentation, where beneficial bacteria produce lactic acid as they consume sugars in the vegetables. Both work, both have been used for thousands of years, both produce delicious and long-lasting preserved foods. Let's explore them both. We start with vinegar pickling, sometimes called quick pickling or fresh pickling. Imagine it is late summer, perhaps August, perhaps early September. Your garden is at peak production. Cucumbers are coming in faster than you can eat them. Zucchini too, and green beans, and more. This abundance is wonderful, but also a challenge. How do you preserve it before it spoils? Pickling is your answer. You begin by preparing your cucumbers. They should be fresh, firm, recently picked. Soft or overripe cucumbers don't. Pickle well. You wash them thoroughly, removing any dirt, any bits of blossom still attached. If they small, perhaps 3 to 5 inches long, you might leave them whole. These will be pickle spears or whole pickles. Larger cucumbers get sliced. Some people prefer spears, the cucumber cut lengthwise into quarters or eighths. Others prefer rounds, sliced crosswise. Still others like chips, very thin slices. Each style has its merits, its own texture and crunch. Next comes the brine. This is a mixture of vinegar, water, salt, and often sugar, along with spices. The proportions matter significantly. Too much vinegar and the pickles are mouth. puckeringly sour, almost painful to eat. Too little, and they might not preserve properly, might ferment or spoil. A typical ratio might be 1 part vinegar to 1 part water, with salt and sugar to taste. The type of vinegar matters too. White distilled vinegar is most common. It is cheap, it is strong, usually 5% acetic acid, and it doesn't discolor the pickles. Apple cider vinegar is popular too, adding a subtle fruity undertone. Wine vinegar, rice vinegar. Each brings its own character. The salt should be pure salt. Canning salt or pickling salt, without additives. Table salt often contains caking agents that can cloud the brine. The sugar is optional but common. It balances the sourness, creates a sweet, sour flavor profile that many people prefer. But the spices, this is where pickling becomes art. For cucumber pickles, dill is traditional. Fresh dill weed, or better yet, the seed heads from dill plants when they've flowered, but also mustard seeds, black or yellow, coriander seeds, black peppercorns, garlic cloves, whole or sliced, bay leaves, hot peppers, jalapeno, serranos, or dried hot peppers. Some people add spices like cinnamon or cloves, though this is less traditional for dill pickles. You bring the brine to a boil. The house fills with the sharp, pungent smell of hot vinegar. It is an assertive smell, almost aggressive, but also somehow clean and bright. As the brine heats, the salt and sugar dissolve completely. The spices release their oils and flavors into the liquid. Meanwhile, you pack your cucumbers into jars. Glass jars are ideal. You want to see the contents. Wide. Mouth jars make packing easier. You add the aromatics to each jar. A few sprigs of dill, a clove or two of garlic, a pinch of mustard seeds, maybe a small hot pepper if you like spicy pickles. Then you pack in the cucumbers. Pack them fairly tightly. They shrink slightly during pickling, so what seems tight now will have some space later. But don't pack so tightly that the brine can circulate. The brine needs to reach every surface. Now you pour the hot brine over the cucumbers, covering them completely. The heat softens the cucumbers slightly, helps the flavors penetrate, kills any surface bacteria. The cucumbers might change color slightly, bright green becoming a more muted olive green. Air bubbles trapped between cucumbers rise to the surface and pop. You leave a bit of headspace at the top of the jar, perhaps half an inch. Then you place the lid on. If you are making refrigerator pickles, you simply let them cool, then store them in the refrigerator. They'll be ready to eat in a day or two and will last for months. For shelf-stable pickles, you'd process these jars in a boiling water bath. The jars are submerged in boiling water for a set amount of time, perhaps 10 or 15 minutes, depending on jar size and altitude. This heat processing creates a vacuum seal as the jars cool and sterilizes the contents. Properly processed pickles can sit on a shelf at room temperature for a year or more. The transformation of cucumber into pickle happens quickly at first, then continues slowly over time. Within hours, the brine penetrates the outer layers of the cucumber. The vinegar solution replaces cell fluids. The bright green color mellows. The texture begins to change, becoming slightly translucent. After a day or two, the cucumbers have become pickles. The sourness has penetrated throughout. The spices have infused their flavors. The texture is still crisp, especially if you've used small, fresh cucumbers, but it is different from fresh. There is a firmness, a snap when you bite into them. If you wait longer, weeks, months, the flavor continues to develop. The pickles mellow. The sharp vinegar edge softens. The spices integrate more fully. Many people think pickles taste best after aging for at least a month, when all the flavors have had time to marry and mellow. The satisfaction of biting into a good pickle is hard to describe. That initial snap as your teeth break through the firm flesh. The burst of sourness balanced by salt and perhaps a hint of sweetness. The explosion of flavors: dill, garlic, mustard, pepper. The way the tartness makes your mouth water. It is refreshing, invigorating, satisfying in a way that sweet foods never quite achieve. But cucumbers are just the beginning. Nearly any vegetable can be pickled. Onions transform into sweet tart condiments, perfect on sandwiches or in salads. Beets become deep magenta, sweet sour, earthy and delicious. Cauliflower takes on a tangy crunch. Green beans stay vibrant and develop complex flavor. Carrots, peppers, radishes, turnips, all excellent pickled. In many cultures, mixed pickles are traditional. Italian giardiniera combines cauliflower, carrots, peppers, olives, celery in a spicy, vinegary brine. Korean banchan includes numerous pickle varieties beyond kimchi. Middle Eastern pickles often feature turnips that turn bright pink from beet juice added to the brine. British pickled onions are a pub staple. Indian ekkas are spiced, oiled pickles that accompany meals. Each culture developed its own traditions, its own flavor profiles, its own preferred vegetables. But the principle remains the same: create an acidic environment where harmful bacteria cannot survive. Now, let's turn to the other type of pickling, fermentation. This is older, probably, than vinegar pickling. It doesn't require vinegar at all. Instead, you're creating conditions for beneficial bacteria to produce acid for you. Sauerkraut is the classic example. Take fresh cabbage, slice it thinly, mix it with salt, pack it into a vessel. That is it. Those are the only essential ingredients: cabbage, salt, thyme. The process is meditative. You take a head of cabbage, fresh, crisp, maybe 2 or 3 pounds. You remove any damaged outer leaves, quarter it, remove the core, then you slice it, very thinly. Some people use a knife, making thin ribbons. Others use a mandolin or special cabbage shredder. The goal is thin, even slices, all roughly the same width. As you slice, the pile of shredded cabbage grows. There is something satisfying about the rhythm of it. Slice after slice, the cabbage transforming from solid head to mound of thin strips. When you're done, you have perhaps 2 to 3 pounds of shredded cabbage. Now you add salt, usually about 2 tablespoons per large cabbage, roughly 1 tablespoon per pound. You sprinkle the salt over the cabbage and begin mixing it in with your hands, massaging the cabbage, working the salt in, squeezing and pressing. This physical working is important. It breaks down cell walls in the cabbage, releasing juice. The salt draws out more moisture through osmosis. Your hands get cold from the cabbage, tingly from the salt. The cabbage begins to wilt. What seemed like a huge volume starts to reduce as the cells break down and release their water. You continue massaging, squeezing, working it. After 10 or 15 minutes, there is noticeably more liquid. The cabbage has wilted significantly. If you press down on it, liquid pools. This is what you want. Enough liquid to cover the cabbage when it is packed down. Now you pack it into your vessel. This might be a ceramic crock, traditional for sauerkraut, or a glass jar. Wide-mouth mason jars work well for smaller batches. You take handfuls of the salted, wilted cabbage and pack it into the vessel. Really pack it. Press down firmly with your fist or a tool, compressing it, eliminating air pockets. The liquid should rise above the cabbage. If it doesn't, keep pressing, keep compressing. If necessary, you can make a small amount of brine, salt dissolved in water, and add enough to cover the cabbage. The cabbage must stay submerged under the liquid. This is crucial. Exposed cabbage will mold, so you weight it down. If you're using a crock, you might place a plate that fits inside the crock on top of the cabbage, then place a weight on the plate, maybe a jar filled with water. If you're using a mason jar, there are special fermentation weights, or you can improvise with a small jar that fits inside the larger one. You cover it loosely, not airtight, as gases from fermentation need to escape, but covered enough to keep out dust and insects. Then you leave it at room temperature and wait. The first day or two, not much happens visibly, but changes are occurring at a microscopic level. Lactic acid bacteria, naturally present on the cabbage, begin to multiply. These are beneficial bacteria, the same type that make yogurt, that live in our digestive systems. They don't need oxygen. In fact, they prefer the anaerobic environment you've created by submerging the cabbage. These bacteria begin consuming the sugars in the cabbage. As they do, they produce lactic acid as a byproduct. This acid lowers the pH of the brine, making it more acidic. This acidic environment prevents harmful bacteria from growing, while allowing the lactic acid bacteria to thrive. After a day or two, you'll see tiny bubbles forming. This is the most visible sign of fermentation. The bubbles rise through the brine, collecting at the surface. There might be a slight tangy smell. If you taste the brine, and you should, to monitor the process, it is beginning to taste slightly sour. Over the following days and weeks, the flavor develops. After 3 days, the sauerkraut is lightly fermented, still quite fresh, just slightly tangy. After a week, the sourness is more pronounced, the flavor more complex. After 2 weeks or more, it is fully fermented, deeply tangy, complex, deliciously sour. You taste it periodically. When it reaches a flavor you like, you move it to cold storage. Cold dramatically slows the fermentation. though it continues very slowly even refrigerated. The sauerkraut can now keep for months, growing more complex and flavorful over time. This same process works for making fermented pickles. Cucumbers in salt brine, allowed to ferment. They become sour pickles, half sours if fermented briefly, full sours if fermented longer. The flavor is completely different from vinegar pickles, more complex, with subtle funk, living and alive, in a way vinegar pickles aren't. Kimchi follows the same principle but with elaborate seasonings. Napa cabbage, radish, garlic, ginger, chili powder, fish sauce or shrimp paste. The vegetables are salted, then coated with a spicy paste packed into vessels, allowed to ferment. The result is spicy, tangy, complex, with layers of flavor that develop over time. These fermentation methods are ancient. People have been making sauerkraut and similar foods for thousands of years. The process was probably discovered by accident. Vegetables stored with salt, naturally fermenting, found to be not only edible but delicious and long-lasting. The beauty of fermentation is that it requires no fuel, no cooking, just salt and time. A family could put up barrels of sauerkraut for winter, using nothing but cabbage from their garden and a few pounds of salt. The fermentation did all the work, transforming raw cabbage into preserved food that would last until spring. And the result is not just preserved food, but food that is actually more nutritious than it started. Fermentation produces vitamins, particularly vitamin C. It makes nutrients more bioavailable, easier for our bodies to absorb. It creates beneficial probiotics, living bacteria that support digestive health. Sugar, like salt, it is a preservative, though it works through different mechanisms. High concentrations of sugar create an environment where bacteria struggle to survive. The sugar ties up available water, making it unavailable to microorganisms through the same osmotic process that makes salt work. This is why honey, which is essentially super-concentrated sugar with very low water content, never spoils. Bacteria simply cannot survive in such a sweet environment. But sugar is also expensive, or at least it was through most of history. While salt could be obtained relatively cheaply from seawater or mines, sugar required cultivation of sugarcane or sugar beets, complex processing, often long-distance trade. So sugar preservation was often reserved for special foods, for treats, for things you wanted to save and savor. The most common form of sugar preservation is making jam, jelly, or preserves. Let's walk through the process of making jam in detail, experiencing the patience and attention it requires. It is a warm summer day, perhaps July or August, depending on where you live and what fruit is in season. You have berries, let's say strawberries, though the process is similar for raspberries, blueberries, blackberries, any soft fruit. You have more than you can eat fresh. Perhaps you've been to a pick your own farm and you returned with several quarts, or perhaps your garden has produced abundantly. These berries are at perfect ripeness, deeply colored, full of flavor, sweet, but with enough tartness to balance. In a day or two they'll be overripe, starting to mold, but you're not going to let that happen. You begin by preparing the berries. The strawberries need their green caps removed. Hulling, this is called. You can use a knife or a special strawberry huller, or just pinch them off with your fingers. This is meditative work. One berry at a time. Hundreds of berries. The pile of hulled berries grows. You might slice large berries in half or leave them whole, depending on your preference. You place them in a large, heavy pot. The pot should be heavy-bottomed. This helps prevent burning. It should be large enough that the berries fill it no more than halfway, because the mixture will bubble and expand as it cooks. Copper pots are traditional for jam making, though stainless steel works well too. Now you add sugar. The typical ratio is about equal parts fruit and sugar by weight. 1 pound of berries, 1 pound of sugar. This seems like a lot of sugar. It is a lot of sugar. But this is what preserves the jam, what gives it its characteristic texture, what makes it last. Some modern recipes use less sugar, but these jams are more like fresh fruit spreads than true preserves. They must be refrigerated and won't last as long. You might add a bit of lemon juice too, a tablespoon or two per pound of fruit. The acid helps with preservation, brightening the flavor and preventing discoloration. More importantly, it helps with setting, with creating that gel-like consistency that makes jam rather than syrup. The acid helps activate pectin, a natural compound in fruit that causes gelling. Some fruits are high in pectin naturally, apples, citrus, cranberries. Others are lower, strawberries, raspberries, blueberries. For low pectin fruits, you might add commercial pectin, a powder or liquid that ensures proper gelling. or you might rely on long cooking and the natural pectin in the fruit. Now you begin heating it. At first, keep the heat moderate. Stir frequently. The sugar dissolves into the juice from the berries. The mixture becomes liquid, the berries floating in sweet syrup. As it heats, the berries soften, releasing more juice. The whole mixture begins to bubble. Once it reaches a full boil, the real work begins. The bubbling is vigorous, almost violent. The mixture rises in the pot, which is why you needed that large pot with plenty of headspace. Steam fills your kitchen, carrying the intense sweet smell of cooking fruit. Windows fog up. The air becomes warm and humid. Now you must watch carefully and stir frequently. The jam can burn if left unattended. As water evaporates, the mixture thickens and becomes more prone to sticking. You scrape the bottom and sides of the pot with your wooden spoon, keeping everything moving. This stage takes time, at least 30 minutes, often an hour or more. As the jam cooks, the color deepens and darkens. Bright red strawberries become deep burgundy. The consistency gradually changes from thin and syrupy to thicker, more viscous. Bubbles change character too, from large, fast, breaking bubbles to smaller, slower bubbles as the mixture thickens. You are watching for the setting point, the moment when there is enough sugar and little enough water that the mixture will gel when cooled. There are various ways to test this. The most reliable is a candy thermometer. You are looking for about 220 degrees Fahrenheit at sea level, adjusting for altitude, about 1 degree lower for every 500 feet above sea level, or you can use the cold plate test. Keep a small plate in the freezer. When you think the jam might be ready, drop a small spoonful onto the cold plate. Wait a moment for it to cool, then push it with your finger. If it wrinkles and stays separated rather than flowing back together, it is ready. If it is still liquid, keep cooking. Some people use the sheeting test. Dip a cold metal spoon into the jam, lift it out, and watch how the jam runs off. At first it will run off in separate drops. As it thickens, the drops begin to merge. When the jam sheets off the spoon, flowing off in a single sheet rather than drops, it is close to being ready. When the jam reaches the setting point, you remove it from heat. Working quickly now. The jam is very hot. You ladle it into clean jars, glass jars, ideally so you can see the beautiful color. You fill them nearly to the top, leaving about a 1/4 inch of headspace. The jam is still liquid at this point, flowing easily from the ladle. But as it cools, it will set, becoming that thick, spreadable consistency. If you are processing the jars for long-term storage, you seal them with sterilized lids and process them in a boiling water bath. The heat ensures any remaining microorganisms are killed and creates a vacuum seal as the jars cool. You hear the lid seal, a distinctive popping sound as the center of each lid is sucked down by the vacuum. As the jam cools in the jars, it sets. The liquid becomes gel. What was loose and flowing becomes thick and spreadable. The transformation is remarkable, entirely due to pectin molecules forming a network that traps the liquid, creating that characteristic jam texture. The color settles into something deep and jewel-like, ruby red for strawberry, deep purple for blueberry, brilliant pink, red for raspberry. These jars of jam catch the light, almost glow. They read beautiful objects in their own right. Quite apart from being food, a jar of jam is concentrated summer. One small 8-ounce jar might contain a pound or more of fruit, cooked down and preserved. The sweetness is intense, almost too intense by modern standards where we reuse to lower sugar fruit spreads. But that sweetness is what preserves it. That high sugar content is what creates an environment where bacteria and mold cannot grow. Without the sugar, this fruit would ferment or mold within days. With proper sugar content and a good seal, it can last a year, 2 years, even longer. Though honestly, most jam doesn't last that long, not because it spoils but because it gets eaten. Good jam doesn't sit on a shelf for long. It gets spread on toast, stirred into yogurt, used in baking, eaten by the spoonful when no one is looking. Jelly is similar to jam but more refined. It is made from fruit juice rather than whole fruit. Making jelly requires an extra step. Extracting the juice, you cook the fruit until it is very soft, almost falling apart. Then you strain it through a jelly bag or several layers of cheesecloth suspended over a bowl. This takes hours. You cannot squeeze or force the juice through. This would make the jelly cloudy. You must let gravity do the work. The juice drips through slowly, clear and perfect. You might leave it overnight, the juice collecting drop by drop in the bowl below. The resulting juice is then cooked with sugar, just like jam. The process is the same, boil until setting point, but the result is different. Jelly is clear, translucent, more delicate than jam. It is firmer too. When properly made, jelly holds its shape, even trembles slightly when shaken. It slices cleanly rather than spreading. Preserves are similar to jam but use larger pieces of fruit or whole small fruits. Strawberry preserves keep the berries whole or halved, suspended in thick, clear syrup. Making good preserves requires even more care than jam. You need to cook the fruit gently so it doesn't fall apart. You need the syrup to be thick enough to suspend the fruit evenly, but you don't want to overcook and make it too thick. The result, when done well, is beautiful. Whole berries suspended in crystal, clear syrup, like jewels in amber. It is more elegant than jam, more refined, meant for special occasions. Marmalade deserves special mention. This is citrus preserve, traditionally made from bitter oranges, with thin slices of peel providing a slightly bitter counterpoint to the sweetness. Making marmalade is a multi-day process. First, you simmer the whole citrus fruits to soften them. This takes hours. Then you slice them thinly, peel and all, removing seeds. The peel contains pectin, so marmalade sets reliably. But it also contains bitter compounds, and this bitterness, balanced against sweetness and tartness, is what makes marmalade special. These sugar, preserved foods aren't trying to taste like fresh fruit. They're their own thing entirely. Jam doesn't taste like fresh strawberries, it tastes like strawberry jam, which is something different and wonderful in its own way. The long cooking, the concentration, the interaction with sugar, all create new flavors deeper and more complex than the original fruit. We've journeyed through centuries of food preservation tonight, from salt rooms to smokehouses, from sun-drenched drying racks to cool root cellars carved into hillsides, from pickle crocks bubbling with fermentation to jam pots simmering for hours. Each method a solution to the fundamental problem of making food last. Take a moment to reflect on what we've explored. The patience these techniques required, the knowledge that had to be accumulated over generations, the care and attention needed to preserve food successfully. These weren't recipes in cookbooks, they were survival skills, essential knowledge, the difference between eating through winter and starving before spring. The people who developed and perfected these methods weren't scientists. They didn't understand the chemistry of osmosis or the biology of bacteria. They didn't need to. They knew that salt worked, that smoke worked, that cool cellars worked. They knew because their ancestors had done it, and their ancestors before them, knowledge stretching back through centuries, even millennia. And they knew patience. Every single technique we've explored requires time. You can't rush salt, curing. The salt needs weeks to penetrate deep into meat. You can't hurry smoking. Cold smoking a ham properly takes a month or more. Fermentation happens at its own pace, not yours. Root vegetables need months of storage to get you through winter. Sun drying takes days or weeks. Sugar preservation demands hours at the stove. There are no shortcuts, no fast-forward buttons, just time, attention, and patient work. In our modern world of instant everything, this patience seems almost foreign. We microwave frozen meals in minutes. We order food delivered in an hour. Our refrigerators keep everything fresh, available instantly. But this convenience is extraordinarily recent. Your great-grandparents lived in a world much more connected to these old preservation methods, and there is wisdom in these old ways. Wisdom about seasonality, about eating what is in season, preserving abundance for scarcity. Wisdom about working with natural processes rather than against them, using the sun's heat to dry, the earth's coolness to store, the natural fermentation of beneficial bacteria. Wisdom about not wasting, about preserving every bit of the harvest because you'll need it. Consider how these methods shaped daily life. The rhythm of the seasons dictated everything. Spring and summer were for growing, for fresh foods eaten immediately. Late summer and autumn were for preserving, jam, making, pickling, drying. Autumn was for slaughter and salt, curing, for filling the root cellar. Winter was for carefully managing stores, for eating preserved food, for making everything last. Spring again brought the first fresh greens just as the cellar emptied. This created a connection to food that we've largely lost. You knew exactly where your food came from. You'd grown it, raised it, hunted it yourself. You knew how much work went into preserving it. You knew that the jar of jam you opened in February represented hours of work in July, that the smoked ham you sliced represented a pig you'd raised, butchered, salted, smoked. that the potatoes you cooked came from your own cellar, from your own harvest. This knowledge created respect for food, for the work of producing and preserving it, for the seasons and their rhythms. Nothing was wasted because waste meant hunger. Every apple, every potato, every bit of meat was valuable, precious even. Many of these techniques are being rediscovered today. Farmers' markets sell traditionally fermented pickles and hand-smoked meats. People are learning to can and preserve again. Some are building root cellars, planting fruit trees specifically for preserving. Books on traditional food preservation are popular. Why? Perhaps we're remembering something important. That there is satisfaction in doing things slowly, carefully, with our own hands. That there is security in having food stored away, in not being entirely dependent on industrial food systems. That there is pleasure in connecting to older ways, to traditions that sustained humanity for millennia. Perhaps we're seeking connection to seasons, to natural rhythms, to the cycle of growth and preservation and consumption. Connection to the past, to our ancestors who did this work out of necessity. Connection to place, preserving local foods, eating local, being part of a local food system. Or perhaps we simply recognize that these old ways produced delicious food. That traditionally fermented sauerkraut tastes better than store-bought. That real smoked ham has depths of flavor that mass-produced ham doesn't approach. That sun-dried tomatoes from your own garden are incomparable. That preserving connects us to our food in ways that buying doesn't. Whatever the reason, these old techniques have value still. Not because we need them for survival. Most of us don't. But because they offer something: skill, knowledge, connection, tradition, flavor, satisfaction. As you drift off to sleep now, or as you finish this journey through preservation history, let these images settle in your mind. The patient work of our ancestors transforming perishable abundance into preserved security. The smokehouses and salt cellars, the root cellars and drying racks, the pickle crocks and jam pots, the knowledge accumulated over generations, the techniques perfected through practice, the rhythm of the seasons guiding everything. These weren't just methods for making food last. They were ways of life, shaping how people lived, what they ate, how they connected to the land and the seasons. They were essential skills, taught carefully from parent to child. They were traditions connecting people to their past and their place. And in their patience, in their slowness, in their requirement for care and attention, they offer us something valuable still. A reminder that good things take time, that some processes cannot be rushed, that there is deep satisfaction in slow, careful work. So as you rest tonight, let yourself appreciate the refrigerator a bit more. That humming box that makes preservation so simple, that keeps everything fresh without any work on your part. It is a miracle of modern life, truly. But also remember what came before, the centuries of patient work, the ingenious methods, the deep knowledge, the respect for food and seasons and the patient passage of time. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the patient art of preservation. Sleep well and dream of smokehouses and cellars, of rows of gleaming jars and barrels of salt pork, of all the quiet ways humans learn to make food last. Until next time, rest peacefully.